So I once had a project idea for my history English class for my students to go and interview actual World War II veterans, because World War II veterans have these incredible stories and they help change our world and maybe even save it, and yet they're not going to be around a lot longer, and there's not a lot more opportunities to preserve and tell their stories. And so I took my students and we interviewed these actual heroes, and then my students, they decided we were going to create these mini documentaries where they would tell the veterans' stories, and then we would rent out a local theater in our downtown, and my students would show their documentaries to the veterans as well as their whole families and the entire city. It was going to be this big event where we would honor the veterans. And so I didn't really know what I was doing. I mean, I'm a history English teacher to these students, not a film teacher, but we were like, let's just go for it. And so we did it, and we had them done just in time for this event. And then everybody showed up. All of my students were there. I had them wear their suits. I mean, this was like a film premiere. And then the doors opened, and these World War II veterans came and sat in the front row as the guests of honor. And then somehow the whole city found out, and over 400 people showed up to see my students' work. And then all of a sudden it was time to show the films, and we go and push play, and they're up on the big screen at this big theater, and nothing. The film doesn't play. So I run back there, I'm like, what's going on? And the guy's like, I don't know, this first one isn't working. I'm like, all right, well, put in the next one. And he puts it in, and the audio is so bad that you could hardly hear a word that any of the veterans are saying. I mean, I'm like, just mortified by this. Like, you've got these World War II vets, people who actually were on the beaches at Normandy, and these films are just awful. Nothing is going right. And so that's kind of how it was for the next 2.5 hours, because some students, their films were like 20 minutes and others were 2 minutes. And I realized in one of my first years of teaching that you really should preview your students' work before you go live on the big screen like this. And so it was rough. I mean, the veterans were still touched and honored, and I learned that the world keeps spinning when things don't go perfect in the classroom. And I also learned that next time I need to review the films before they go live. And so the next year we went and interviewed more World War II veterans, and we did the exact same thing, except this time I previewed and made sure everything worked, and all the films were around 6 minutes and none half an hour long or none 30 seconds long. And we had another big event, and we brought the next round of World War II veterans, and they came and we filled this theater, and again, like 400 or 500 people showed up, because World War II veterans are awesome and people love honoring them. And we showed the films, and you could hardly hear a word they were saying. I mean, their voices were just not very loud. And on the big screen, it just didn't translate the way that it did on a small laptop. And so for about an hour, we watched these films, and nobody in the crowd could hear a word the veterans were saying. And so again, I was like, come on, Muir, you've got to be better than this. And so the next year, and again, the veterans were very appreciative, and my students learned a lot from this. But then the next year, I was like, we are going to nail it this time. We're going to get this right. And so I had my students create subtitles. And so after checking everything, I made sure that the audio worked, the video worked, and there were subtitles at the bottom of the screen. So if somebody was hard of hearing, they would still be able to read what was said in the documentaries. What could possibly go wrong? Well, I didn't exactly check my students' subtitles before they went up. And so at this big event where hundreds of people came out, including World War II veterans, the subtitles were garbage. I mean, I'm talking like the word I wasn't capitalized in many of the films. Some of my students spelt the word you with the letter U, and some of the veterans' names were misspelled, or they weren't capitalized at the beginning, and it was just awful. And I remember after the event, there was a lot of praise for my students for how great these films were. But I remember veterans coming up to me, just sweet as can be, saying, "Teach, that was really wonderful. I'm really touched. But man, do you need to teach those kids how to spell." Or man, do you need to teach those kids some grammar. And again, it was just awful. And I'm sure if you've done any type of project like this before, you know exactly what I'm talking about. When things don't go right, when you have these type of distractions that distract from the overall body of work that students did. And so the next year, year number 4, we did the same project again, except this time I used it as an opportunity to teach my kids grammar. Like, we did some grammar practice, we did worksheets, we did repetition, except this time the grammar wasn't so you could just learn grammar, and it wasn't so you can get the right grade on this grammar unit. It was so that you could have subtitles that wouldn't distract anybody from the overall body of work that you are creating. It's so that you could truly honor these veterans all the way through in these films. And so we learned grammar. And then they applied that grammar and that spelling and capitalization and all of that syntax into their films. And then for the fourth time, we had a huge event. And we honored these veterans, just like we did those other times, except this time we just put excellence into their work. And it was beautiful, and it was incredible. And the veterans afterwards just couldn't stop gushing about what this meant to them and their families. It meant so much to them as well. And it was something we'll never forget. And so I can spend more time talking about why this was such a great project and why we need to honor our veterans and our elders more, but we'll do that some other time. This one is about how we honor them with good grammar. Or proper grammar. Good is a kind of a weak word. English teachers,